Welcome to the Commander's Beacon. I am Eric, and this channel is all about unconventional commander decks. Okay, so it is time. Last week, I kind of said that I would not be doing a deck tech for Odric Bloodcursed, because the card is bad. But then I thought about it, and you know what? I was wrong. Well, not about that. Odric is still bad, but we're going to do it anyways. I thought, you know what? Let's build Odric. Now, despite being a bad card, I just checked it out, and Odric is the 6th most popular commander from Innistrad Crimson Vow right now, by the number of decks on EDHREC. And he definitely does not deserve that. But people are still playing Odric, despite the fact that the card is bad. And, okay, I guess it sort of makes sense. I mean, Odric is a well-established character. He's just died and turned into a vampire, but he's still a good guy, I think, in the lore, so that's pretty cool. And the card art is pretty sweet too, both of them. But enough about all of that. Why is Odric bad, and why are we building him anyways? Well, Odric is a 3/3 vampire soldier that costs 1 red-white. Paying respects to his previous iteration, Odric Lunarch Marshal, Odric the Bloodcursed really cares about creatures with keyword abilities, while having none himself. Odric has, when Odric Bloodcursed enters the battlefield, you create X blood tokens, where X is the number of abilities from among Flying, First Strike, Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Reach, Trample, and Vigilance found among creatures you control. So a blood token is a new type of artifact token, kind of like clues or treasures. You can pay 1 and tap and sacrifice a blood token and discard a card to draw a card. Now, I personally don't think blood tokens are all that great, since you probably need to build around getting value from that discard effect to make them worth it. Which we'll definitely do here, since Odric only makes blood tokens, and that's all he does. But when you do build around that discard effect, blood tokens are not bad. They basically give all of your cards cycling for 1 mana, as long as you have enough blood tokens to do so. So Odric makes these blood tokens, which are fine, and he cares about keyword abilities on creatures like First Strike and Menace. So what can we do with Odric? So first, Odric has an enters the battlefield effect, so to really be worthwhile, we'll need to trigger that effect more than just once when we cast him, so we'll need blink effects. Secondly, of course, we need keyword abilities. Now, I'm not so interested in some of the creatures that are popular in Odric decks right now, like Rograk or Aerial Responder. Yes, these guys have a bunch of keywords for a very reasonable mana cost, or no mana cost, but they're also a whole lot of do-nothing, other than making Odric pump out a few more blood tokens, which is still admittedly mediocre. So instead, I think as long as we want to blink Odric for more and more blood tokens, we might as well play with other creatures with good enters the battlefield effects, especially ones that also have keyword abilities that Odric cares about. We'll also of course play with some incentives to create those blood tokens. There's a reasonable number of cards to choose from, like cards with Madness, that we can cast when we discard them when we're sacrificing a blood token. There's other cards as well that just trigger when we discard things. And of course there are cards that just like it when we create a lot of artifacts. And that's a brief introduction to this deck. We're going to use blink effects to generate value, we'll put a priority on ETB creatures with keyword abilities, and we'll use Odric's trigger for some added card filtering advantage or the occasional artifact or discard synergy. We'll also play with some additional blink-related infinite combos or keywords matter synergies to help us finish the game. But we'll talk about those in more detail later. For now, let's get into the contents of this Odric Bloodcursed deck, starting with some of our creatures. So I really wanted to focus on using creatures that have both ETB effects and keyword abilities, since Odric really wants to be blinked, and again, as long as we're blinking Odric, we might as well blink our other creatures too. Fortunately, there are a lot of creatures with both ETBs and keywords that we can choose from for all sorts of different roles, like card draw, mana ramp, and removal, and just general value. Skyscanner and Welcoming Vampire, for example, are both great card draw in a blink deck. Both of these have flying too to benefit Odric. Skyscanner is a 3-mana 1/1 artifact creature. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Welcoming Vampire is a new, probably mono white deck staple, or at least a staple for any mono white deck that plays a lot of small creatures or makes creature tokens. It's a 2/3 vampire with flying that costs 2 and a white, and it has whenever one or more other creatures with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control, you draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Now this is pretty cool because it just adds draw a card onto a lot of our other ETB effects, as long as that effect is coming from a creature with power 2 or less. Now white actually has a lot of ETB effects that help us ramp, or at least get lands into our hand so that we can make all of our land drops. And quite a few of them have keyword abilities too, like Knight of the White Orchid, Loyal Warhound, and Boreas Charger. Knight of the White Orchid has first strike, and it lets you search your library for a plains and put it onto the battlefield when it enters the battlefield, as long as another player has more lands than you, and somebody probably will because you're not playing green. Loyal Warhound does the same, but it has vigilance instead of first strike, and it only searches for a basic plains, whereas Knight of the White Orchid can search for any plains, but either way, this is still good. Boreas Charger also lets you search for plains cards in your library if an opponent has more lands than you, but it does this when it leaves the battlefield, which isn't quite as good, but still, we're playing a blink deck so we can trigger leaves the battlefield effects pretty readily as well. And Boreas Charger also has a keyword for us with flying. Now we'll also use Farfinder and the new Ambitious Farmhand. These don't actually ramp us since they don't put lands into play, but they do help us make sure that we hit our land drops. Farfinder is a 3-mana 1/1 with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you get to search your library for a basic land, put it in your hand. Ambitious Farmhand lets you search for a basic plains to your hand when it enters the battlefield. It doesn't have any keywords, but you can pay 1 white to transform it, and it transforms into Seasoned Cathar, which is a 3/3 with lifelink, so that's okay. Now we've also got ETB creatures with keywords that function as removal spells. Cataclysmic Gearhulk has vigilance, and an ETB effect that forces each player to sacrifice all but one of their artifacts, creatures, enchantments, and planeswalkers. Cavalier of Dawn also has vigilance, and when it ETBs, you generous gift a thing. You destroy target non-land permanent, and its controller makes a 3/3 golem creature token. You could even target one of your own blood tokens with this if you really need the board presence. Now when Cavalier of Dawn dies, you get to return target artifact or enchantment from your graveyard to your hand, and that's just fine too. We're not really using sacrifice outlets in this deck, but we do have recursion to get it back in case it dies, or in case we discard it to a blood token, so you may get this death trigger as well. And then we'll play Solitude. This one is pretty cool. It's a 3/2 creature with flash and lifelink, though note that Odric doesn't care about the flash ability. It costs 3 white, and when it enters the battlefield, you Swords to Plowshares a thing. You exile the creature, and its controller gains life equal to its power. But you can also evoke Solitude by exiling a white card from your hand, so it's one of those nice spells you can cast without paying mana if you need to. And I really like Solitude here, because an ETB exile-based removal is a pretty powerful ability. Now we've got several blink effects in this deck, but a couple of those are on creatures with enters the battlefield effects. Restoration Angel has flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you blink another one of your non-angel creatures. There's Lumbering Battlement, which has vigilance, and it can exile any number of non-token creatures you control when it enters the battlefield, until it leaves the battlefield. And yes, you can combo these two together for infinite blink effects, but we'll talk more about that later. And now let's talk about recursion. I wanted a few graveyard recursion pieces in this deck, just because you should be taking advantage of your graveyard, but also because our blood tokens give us a discard sub-theme. And with graveyard recursion, we'll be able to safely discard useful cards because we can recover them later, or sooner. Karmic Guide is a white graveyard recursion staple. This is a 5-mana 3/3 angel. It has flying, which makes Odric happy, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It also has Echo for 3 white, but if you can flicker it enough, or just let it die and then recur it with something else, then you won't need to pay that cost. Of course, we'll play Sun Titan. It's got vigilance, by the way, and it returns any target permanent from your graveyard to the battlefield with mana value 3 or less when it enters the battlefield or attacks. And of course, Angel of Serenity. This is another one with flying, and I can't recommend this card enough. Yes, it is 7 mana, which is a lot, but it's super dumb when you blink it. So when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 3 other target creatures from the battlefield, and or creature cards from graveyards. And when it leaves the battlefield, you return the exiled cards to their owner's hands. Okay, so we're going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, because I really just need to highlight how dumb this card is. First, when it enters the battlefield, you get to target 3 things. Maybe you have 3 creatures in your graveyard, and you can exile them, and then when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, you put all 3 of those creatures into your hand. 3 of them, all at once. That's dumb. Now also notice, you can target creatures on the battlefield, like your opponent's creatures. 3 of them, all at once. And when Angel of Serenity leaves the battlefield, you return those creatures to their owner's hands. So if you blink Angel of Serenity, you basically bounce 3 of your opponent's creatures, which is super oppressive. You would expect blue to do this, but the fact that we can do this in white is really awesome. And you can do any combination of bouncing your opponent's creatures and recurring your own. Maybe bounce 2 of your opponent's things and get 1 of your own things back from the graveyard. So it's really versatile. Now also notice that Angel of Serenity's enters the battlefield effect and leaves the battlefield effect are separate triggers. So if you're playing with sacrifice outlets or something, then you can sacrifice Angel of Serenity in response to its enters the battlefield effect going on the stack. You know, when you've chosen to exile 3 of your opponent's creatures. Then you sacrifice Angel of Serenity in response, and the leaves the battlefield effect will trigger before the enters the battlefield effect has resolved, and TLDR, you've just exiled 3 of your opponent's creatures forever. Now we're not really playing with sacrifice in this deck, but Angel of Serenity is still a really, really good card for topping out the high end of our mana curve. Okay, now that PSA is out of the way, play more Angel of Serenity. We do have other ETB creatures with keyword abilities as well. A Direfleet Daredevil has first strike, and when it enters the battlefield you get to exile an instant or sorcery from an opponent's graveyard, and you can cast it this turn. And you can spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast the spell. So this is a great blink target to repeatedly steal your opponent's spells. Then there's Elite Spellbinder. This is sort of a mini stacks piece. It also has flying. When it enters the battlefield, you get to look at target opponent's hand, and you can exile a non-land card from it. They can still play that card, but a spell cast this way costs 2 more to cast. So each time you blink Elite Spellbinder, you get to add a 2-mana tax to whatever card you want from your opponent's hand. Well, whatever non-land card. And of course, you get to look at your opponent's hand, and I don't know about you, but I like knowing what cards my opponents have. Now, I also like Thopter Engineer. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 Thopter token with flying, so that's a mediocre ETB effect. But it also gives all of your artifact creatures haste. So when you combine it with the 1/1 flying Thopter that you just created, it gives you 2 keyword abilities for Odric. But for a bit more impact, I also like Angel of Invention. This is a 5-mana angel, and it has 3 keyword abilities all on its own, flying, first strike, and vigilance. It also has Fabricate 2, so whenever it enters the battlefield, you can either make 2 1/1 servo creature tokens, or put 2 +1/+1 counters on Angel of Invention. And making 2 1/1s every time you blink it is pretty decent value. And it even buffs all of your creatures by +1/+1. Okay, so those are some of our creatures that are great blink targets, but also provide keyword abilities for Odric. But we do have other useful creatures in this deck. Some of them don't have ETBs, and some of them don't have keyword abilities, but they still provide a lot of value. So let's talk about those creatures next. So we've got even more creatures with powerful ETB effects. I wanted most of my ETB creatures to have keyword abilities, but some are so useful that we'll play them even if they don't have keywords. Like Dockside Extortionist. As you may have guessed by now, this particular deck is not a budget deck, because I really wanted to let Odric perform at his best. And as long as we're playing with blink effects, Dockside Extortionist is going to do a lot of work, no further justification needed. Now I also like Thraben Inspector in the early game. It's just 1 mana for a 1/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you make a clue token. So this can help you keep your hand filled if you start running out of gas, and for a very low mana investment. Of course, we'll also play Imperial Recruiter, which just helps us find any of our power 2 or less creatures from our library whenever it enters the battlefield. Now there's also Revolutionist. This is a 3/3 human wizard that costs 5 in a red, but you'll rarely pay that much since it also has Madness for 3 in a red. So you can cast Revolutionist if you discard it, like when you sacrifice a blood token, by paying its madness cost. And then when Revolutionist enters the battlefield, you get to return an instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. So yeah, more graveyard recursion, this time for our spells. And now we've also got several creatures that don't have ETB effects, but they still provide a lot of value. Like Angel of Condemnation. It's 4 mana, it has flying and vigilance, and you can pay 2 and a white and tap it to exile another creature, then return that creature to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step. So this is another way to blink your creatures, or of course you can target your opponent's creatures too, if you need to. Now for the low end of the mana curve, I've picked Chaplain of Alms. This is a 1 mana 1/1 with first strike and ward 1. Now Odric doesn't care about the ward, but he does like the first strike. But Chaplain of Alms also has Disturb, so you can cast it from your graveyard transformed for its Disturb cost of 3 and a white. So it's also great discard fodder for your blood tokens, since you can just discard it from your hand and then recast it from your graveyard disturbed. And when you disturb Chaplain of Alms, it becomes Chaplain Shieldgeist, which has flying and first strike, and it gives all of your creatures ward 1. So this is minor protection for all of your creatures, it gives you some keywords. Of course, we'll also play Conspiracy Theorist. This guy doesn't have an ETB effect or keywords, but we're playing it anyways, so you know it must be great in this deck. So Conspiracy Theorist is a 2 mana 2/2, and when it attacks you can pay 1 and discard a card, and if you do, you draw a card. That's fine, but we really like its second ability. Whenever you discard 1 or more non-land cards, you may exile one of them from your graveyard. If you do, you may cast it this turn. Now, notice the second ability doesn't care why you discarded the card, so you can sacrifice a blood token, discard something you were going to play anyways, and Conspiracy Theorist trigger to let you exile that card, and then you can cast it from exile this turn. So you're basically not even really discarding it. And of course we've also got Anger. This is a 4 mana 2/2 with haste, but as long as it's in your graveyard and you control a mountain, creatures you control have haste. So again, a really great card to discard to a blood token, and then you'll just permanently add another keyword for Odric. Well, at least until someone exiles your graveyard. And we'll also use Stromkirk Occultist. This is a 3 mana 3/2 with trample, which is a somewhat uncommon keyword in red and white. When it deals combat damage to a player, you exile the top card of your library, and you can play that card until the end of the turn. But it also has Madness for 1 and a red, so it's a great discard option too. So those are most of the noteworthy creatures in this deck. We've got a few more to go over later, but first, let's discuss some of our other blood token synergies. So again, Odric has an ETB that makes blood tokens, and we've talked about ETB effects on a lot of our other creatures, but let's go into a bit more detail about Odric's ETB effect. How are we going to make all these blood tokens, and what do we do with them? So we've covered some of our creature-based blink effects with cards like Angel of Condemnation or Restoration Angel, but we have plenty of other ways to repeat our Enter the Battlefield effects. Conjurer's Closet and Teleportation Circle let you blink one of your creatures at the end of each of your turns, so you'll get repeated value over time. Panharmonicon doubles all of your ETB effects, which is obviously pretty powerful. Now, as long as we're generating blood tokens, we'll also use some cards that synergize directly with blood tokens, or at least with the discard cost that we need to pay to activate them. We already mentioned Conspiracy Theorist, for example, but there's also this cool new card from Crimson Vow Commander decks, and that's Arterial Alchemy. This is a 3 mana enchantment that creates a blood token for each opponent you have when it enters the battlefield, but it also has blood tokens you control are equipment in addition to their other types, and have equipped creature gets +2/+0, and equip 2. So this is a pretty interesting way to literally weaponize your blood tokens. I don't think it's super powerful, but I do really like that it gives you another way to use those blood tokens, which I think you'll really want because you won't always want that pseudo-cycling effect. Now we'll also use a small number of Madness and Discard synergies. We've already mentioned some of these, like Stromkirk Occultist. Now we'll also play Bag of Holding, which is pretty decent card advantage in a discard deck. Now, this is a 1 mana artifact, and it has whenever you discard a card, exile that card from your graveyard. And you can pay 2 and tap the Bag of Holding to draw a card and then discard a card. Now you can also pay 4 and tap and sacrifice the Bag of Holding to return all cards exiled with it to your hand. So this lets you recover all of those cards you've discarded with your blood tokens. You know, as long as some jerk doesn't blow up your Bag of Holding first. Now note that when you discard something and it gets exiled under Bag of Holding, it'll be exiled face up, so your opponents will know what you're reserving under it. And since it costs 4 mana to sacrifice it and get those cards back, it might be hard to hold up that much free mana at all times in case someone tries to remove the Bag of Holding. So this is not a foolproof way to protect your discarded cards, so just be careful with it. But still, you will probably get a lot of value from Bag of Holding. Now I'm also running a few more Madness cards. Now this isn't an Anj Falconwrath deck, so we can't get away with running terrible cards just because they have Madness, but we can run a few. Fiery Temper, Frantic Purification, and Avacyn's Judgment are all removal spells that we can cast with Madness when we discard them. Fiery Temper does 3 damage to any target, and it has a Madness cost of just a single red mana. Frantic Purification destroys to a target enchantment, and it has a Madness cost of just a single white mana. And Avacyn's Judgment is a 2-mana sorcery that deals 2 damage divided as you choose, among any number of targets. But it also has a Madness cost for X and a red, and then it deals X damage, divided as you choose instead. And what's cool about Madness is that you get to cast the card when you discard it, so you can ignore timing restrictions. So if you sacrifice a blood token, for example, and discard a Madness card, you get to cast that card right now, even if it's a sorcery and it's not your main phase. Okay, so one more thing I want to mention is that we've got a few more ways to get those keyword abilities for Odric. So in addition to creatures that naturally have keywords, we'll use other permanents as well that grant them. First, there's some equipment, like Basilisk Collar, Shadow Spear, and Swiftfoot Boots. I've focused on high-value, low-cost equipment here. A Basilisk Collar, for example, grants Lifelink and Death Touch, and it only costs 1 to cast and 2 to equip. The Shadow Spear grants Lifelink and Trample, and again only costs 1 to cast and 2 to equip. Swiftfoot Boots costs just 2 to cast and 1 to equip, and it grants Hexproof and Haste. So these are quick and easy ways to get some more keywords for Odric, but we'll also use a few lands to help us out too. A Slayer's Stronghold lets you pay red and white and tap it to give a target creature +2/+0 and Vigilance and Haste until end of turn. Blinkmoth Nexus lets you pay 1 to turn it into a 1/1 artifact creature with flying until end of turn, so you can use this to gain access to the flying keyword ability whenever you need to. And then there's Emiria's Call. This is an MDFC land that on the backside enters tapped unless you pay 3 life as a land, and it taps for white. But the front side is a 7-mana sorcery that has you make 2 4/4 angel creature tokens with flying, and non-angel creatures you control get indestructible until your next turn. So this is a lot of mana, but it does technically give you up to 2 keywords, flying from the angels, and indestructible on all of your other creatures, if you have any. Okay, so those are some of the ways that we'll generate and take advantage of our blood tokens with Odric. Now how are we going to actually win the game? Okay, so we're blinking creatures or generating value, maybe we're amassing blood tokens and using them to dig through our deck, but how do we actually finish the game? This deck has a few infinite combos and some non-infinite power combos. I've tried to focus only on combos where the pieces themselves are useful outside of the combo. So first we'll use the classic Kiki-Jiki Zealous Conscripts combo. Kiki-Jiki taps to make a token of a target non-legendary creature you control. That creature token has haste, and you sacrifice it at the end of the turn. And when Zealous Conscripts enters the battlefield, you gain control of target permanent until end of turn, and you untap that permanent, and it gains haste until the end of the turn. So with both Zealous Conscripts and Kiki-Jiki on the field, you tap Kiki-Jiki to make a token copy of Zealous Conscripts. That token copy will target Kiki-Jiki with its ETB effect, untapping Kiki-Jiki and letting you tap it to make another copy of Zealous Conscripts. Then you can repeat this indefinitely to create infinite hasty token copies of Zealous Conscripts and then attack for the win. Now I like this combo because both pieces are really useful in a blink deck, even if we don't have the combo assembled. We can continually blink Zealous Conscripts to temporarily steal things, or at the very least untap our own things, and Kiki-Jiki can just serve as another ETB enabler by letting us create token copies of our ETB creatures. So again, these pieces are useful on their own, even outside of the combo. So our next combo involves Restoration Angel, Lumbering Battlement, and any other blink effect. So first you'll need to use Lumbering Battlement to exile Restoration Angel, and you can exile any other creatures with it too, like Odric. Then you'll need to use another blink effect, like Ephemerate, to blink the Lumbering Battlement. Note that you'll need to use a blink effect that returns the creature to the battlefield immediately, and not at the end of the turn. So when Lumbering Battlement leaves the battlefield, Restoration Angel will re-enter the battlefield. Lumbering Battlement also puts its ETB on the stack because it also just entered the battlefield. You'll target Lumbering Battlement with Restoration Angel's ETB effect, but you'll arrange the triggers so that Lumbering Battlement's effect resolves first. And when it does, you'll choose to exile Restoration Angel and whatever other creatures you want. Then Restoration Angel's ETB effect will resolve. This will blink the Lumbering Battlement. So the Restoration Angel will return to the battlefield, generating its ETB effect. You'll also generate Lumbering Battlement's ETB effect again. So again, you'll have your Restoration Angel target your Lumbering Battlement, but have your Lumbering Battlement's ETB effect resolve first, and exile the Restoration Angel. And you can repeat this effect as many times as you want for infinite creature ETBs. And remember, you can blink other creatures as well with Lumbering Battlement, so you can, for example, blink Odric infinitely to create infinite blood tokens, and this can just kill your opponents with infinite damage from Reckless Fireweaver. Or you can just use those creatures entering the battlefield to kill your opponents directly with Impact Tremors. Now, Impact Tremors is mostly in this deck to support these infinite blink combos, but on the other hand, it is still useful in a blink deck because we'll always have creatures entering the battlefield, and some of those creatures even make creature tokens, which give us even more Impact Tremors triggers. Now for our next combo, we've got Dockside Extortionist, plus Krark Clan Ironworks, and Eldrazi Displacer. And now to execute this combo, you'll need your opponents to have at least 2 artifacts or enchantments amongst them, which they should have most of the time. So you can use Eldrazi Displacer to blink your Dockside Extortionist, and if you create at least 2 treasures, you can sacrifice both of them to the Krark Clan Ironworks for 4 colorless mana. You can use 3 of that mana to use Eldrazi Displacer and blink your Dockside again, effectively generating infinite colorless mana. Now if your opponents have enough artifacts and enchantments amongst them, you will also generate infinite colored mana, because you'll have excess treasures. Now if you've got that Reckless Fireweaver, this is already a win. But even if you don't, if you've also got Odric, and because you've got infinite mana, you probably also have Odric if you want to, then you can blink Odric infinitely to create infinite blood tokens, if you have at least 1 keyword ability amongst your creatures. Now you still have infinite mana, so you can use that mana to activate as many blood tokens as you want, and cycle through your deck to find whatever win condition you happen to find. Now I also like Krark Clan Ironworks in this deck outside of this combo, because it's just another way to put your blood tokens to use by turning them into mana. Now for our last combo, we've got the Keywords Matter combo. This combo is centered mainly around Akroma, Vision of Ixidor, combined with 1 or more other Keywords enablers. Now Akroma is a 6/6 angel that costs 5 white, and she has 4 keyword abilities on her own, Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, and Trample. Now she also has, at the beginning of each combat, until end of turn, each other creature you control gets +1/+1 if it has Flying, +1/+1 if it has First Strike, and so on for Double Strike, Death Touch, Haste, Hexproof, Indestructible, Lifelink, Menace, Protection, Reach, Trample, Vigilance, and Partner. So Akroma gives your other creatures +1/+1 for each relevant keyword ability they've got, letting you possibly make your army really, really big. Now Akroma can be combined with Odric Lunarch Marshal, Akroma's Memorial, and or Kaldra Complete to buff up your creatures and threaten a combat damage win. Odric Lunarch Marshal effectively shares your keyword abilities between your creatures, and since Akroma has 4 keyword abilities, at the very minimum, Odric will share those abilities with your other creatures, giving your other creatures at least +4/+4 on top of Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, and Trample. Or you could just use Akroma's Memorial, which gives all of your creatures 5 keyword abilities, that is Flying, First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. So Akroma Vision of Ixidor will then give all of those creatures an additional +5/+5. This is basically mono white Craterhoof Behemoth, though it takes a couple of cards to make it happen. Now Akroma is even decent with Kaldra Complete. This equipment only buffs 1 creature, but it does give that creature +5/+5 and 4 keyword abilities, that is First Strike, Trample, Indestructible, and Haste, so it'll also get an additional +4/+4 from Akroma, which is pretty scary. So this isn't an infinite combo, but it will definitely pressure a combat damage win if you've got enough board presence. And even outside of this combo, these pieces can help give you a lot more keywords to generate blood tokens with Odric Bloodcursed as well. So those are the combos that we're focusing on in this deck, and some of those combos rely on Odric's blood tokens, but some don't. But even for the ones that don't, you can still use Odric's blood tokens to help you dig through your deck to find those combo pieces. And that is most of the deck. As always, you can see the link to the full deck list in the description. For now, let's go over the deck stats and cost. Alright, deck stats. Now, before we get into the typical stats, like how many creatures or removal spells the deck has, we need to remember that Odric Bloodcursed cares about how many distinct keyword abilities we have on the battlefield. So, for example, we'd much rather have, a creature with First Strike, and a creature with Vigilance, and a creature with Trample, rather than just, 3 creatures with First Strike. So ideally, we want to balance out those keywords in the deck as evenly as possible. Unfortunately, keywords are not all printed equally, especially within Boros colors, but let's look at how this deck fares. When it comes to flying, we have 13 sources in this deck. Now again, this can be from creatures or from other effects that grant flying. White has access to a lot of flyers, so getting flying is pretty easy in this deck. We also have 6 cards that grant or have First Strike. First Strike is also fairly common in white, and somewhat in red, but it just so happens that the ETB creatures that we really want in this deck just don't have First Strike as often as they have flying. But we still have a reasonable number of sources of First Strike. Now when it comes to Double Strike, we have no sources in this deck. Double Strike is a strong ability, but it just wasn't present on any of the ETB creatures that we really wanted for this deck. We also have a single source of Death Touch. Death Touch isn't really found much on red or white creatures, so we only have a single equipment that grants it. We also have 7 sources of Haste. Haste is fairly common, especially in red, and so we'll have no shortage of it in this deck. When it comes to Hexproof, we have a single source. This is another one that's fairly rare among all creatures in Magic, and it just doesn't coincide with any of the ETB effects that we value. And we also have 2 sources of Indestructible. Again, this is a fairly rare ability, so it's hard to get too much of this. This deck has 5 sources of Lifelink. Lifelink is a reasonably common keyword on white creatures, though we don't have too many with ETB effects that we care about. Now this deck has 0 sources of Menace. Menace is sometimes found in red, but we just didn't have any ETB creatures that provided good value to us that also had Menace. We also have 0 sources of Reach. The Reach is pretty hard to find in red and white. This deck has 5 sources of Trample, and finally we have 7 sources of Vigilance. Vigilance is another very common one found in white. So we can see that this deck has a reasonable access to about 6 of the keywords that Odric cares about, and marginal access to another 3 keywords. So this means that Odric can generate as many as 9 blood tokens each time it enters the battlefield, but more commonly you'll probably generate 2 to 5 tokens. And that's just fine. We're using a lot of repeatable blink effects. If we need to make dozens of blood tokens for some reason, we can generate them over time by blinking Odric repeatedly. Now, as far as the deck's other stats are concerned, our average mana value in this deck is 3.47. That's a bit high, but that value does include some MDFC lands with expensive spells on the front side, like Emiria's Call and Undo Inversion, as well as some cards with Madness that you'll likely cast for their Madness cost, rather than their more expensive normal mana cost. So in practice, the average mana value feels lower than the actual value. We have 36 creatures in this deck because we really care about keywords, so we want a lot of creatures. 24 of those creatures in our deck have enters the battlefield or leaves the battlefield effects that we can abuse with our blink strategies. Speaking of which, we have 9 blink enablers in this deck, and most of them are repeatable, so having just a single one of them will make a big difference. We also have 8 cards that give us some value when we discard, like Bag of Holding or Madness cards, and these are just going to give us an easier time using those blood tokens that Odric generates. This deck also has 8 card draw cards, not counting the card filtering that we get from Odric's blood tokens. And then we have 11 sources of mana ramp and or mana fixing. And finally we have 10 pieces of single target removal and 4 board wipes. At the time of this recording, this deck has a value of $452.96 on tcgplayer.com. Again, I didn't design this one to be a budget deck because I really wanted to give Odric a good chance to be successful, and I thought the best way to do this was to incorporate a few infinite combos. And most of those combos have somewhat expensive pieces. But increasing the deck budget also allows us to play with more effective rampant card draw like Smothering Tithe and Esper Sentinel, and this really helps address the Boros color combination's weakness in these areas. Alright, so that is Odric Bloodcursed. And again, I know that this commander is admittedly weaker than we'd all like, so instead of just making a weak deck, this deck is using a blink strategy with lots of payoffs that are independent of Odric. On the other hand, we don't need to underestimate Odric. Odric does provide us a lot of card selection utility, and his blood tokens can help us dig through our deck for those combo pieces. Now remember that you'll need keyword abilities for Odric to do anything. And you'll also probably either want dead cards in your hand that you don't mind discarding, or at least some discard synergies before you start sacrificing your blood tokens. So you probably won't want to cast Odric right away once you hit 3 mana. Odric is much more useful in the mid and late game to help keep your hand filled or to dig through your deck for exactly what you need. And having that sort of card draw, or at least card filtering, in the command zone in a Boros deck is actually pretty rare, even if Odric does make you jump through a few hoops to get that card advantage. So overall, I think Odric is actually deceptively a decent commander here, as long as we don't try to over-rely on it and make Odric the centerpiece of the deck. Odric is here for some added value and advantage. And as long as we recognize its limitations, we can really take advantage of what it does have to offer us. Anyways, that is Odric, and that is all I've got for today. If you enjoyed this deck tech, please do like the video and or subscribe to the channel. That's always really helpful and appreciated. We're approaching 500 subscribers now, so thanks again to all of you for continuing to watch and subscribe. But check back next time where we'll cover some more Innistrad Crimson Vow decks. I'm working on a curses deck that I might go over, since we got a lot of new curses in these 2 new Innistrad sets, Midnight Hunt and Crimson Vow. I'm also working on a possible build for Halana and Elena. It's still in the early stages, so I can't say yet if it'll work out. As always, let me know in the comments if there's any specific commander or strategy you'd like to see a deck built around, especially an unconventional deck. But anyways, thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.